Welcome to another edition of Code M Radio. I'm Daryl Scott. For the next 60 minutes, Code M Radio will address topics that affects the lives of people around the world. Code M Radio is just one part of Code Media Group, LLC, which also publishes Code M Magazine. The mission of Code M Magazine is to create a trusting community among men that will inspire, educate, and act as a credible resource throughout the journey to manhood. You can visit our website, codemmagazine.com, for more information. If you wish to follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, it's CodeMagIntl. That's CodeMagIntl. As always, I am joined by the Reverend Dr. Leah Lewis. Leah, how are you today?
I'm pretty good, Daryl. How about you?
I am fine. The sun is shining. It was a great day today. I'm just ready to get into this discussion with this rather impressive gentleman.
Well, I tell you, I'm excited because we have as our guest today, retired police officer Quintero Mack. He is a retired officer with 35 years of experience with the Cleveland Heights Police Department, and he served a number of roles in that capacity over the course of those years. Officer Mack, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Reverend Lewis?
I am well, and we're glad to have you today. Let me start with a very fundamental question. Why did you decide to become a police officer?
That's an excellent question, and that's a question I've probably heard, to be honest with you, 1,000 times. I can share with all three of you that I've had really good experiences during my growth and development from very young age, grade school, adolescence, juvenile, all the way through with police. On character of what you see today. Officers in my community at the time were very helpful. They were all about safety, making sure you got to and from school. I actually played high school basketball and baseball for years. And there were times that the police officers in which the community I grew up in, East Cleveland, gave us rides home to make sure you got home safe. And I'm talking in the late 70s.
Yeah, I'm a part of that. We talked earlier that you and I graduated around the same time, and there were some tough rivalries back then, and the police really had some influence on students and people during games and after games. Was that an influence for you?
I believe so, wholeheartedly. You're impacted in your life by your life's experiences, no matter what they are. And, not having to deal with the police in a negative way or negative environment during my time was an inspiration to me to look more into the career and what it was about as time prevailed.
How did you migrate to the Cleveland Heights Police Force?
I think it's fair to say that it's all about testing. Wherever you score well and have an opportunity to get hired. With police work, and I know some of it's changing now because they're doing a lot online, which that was not the case back in the day. You had to go to a facility and take a test on a given date and time. So I will tell you, I took, several different exams across greater Cleveland, Northeast Ohio. And it just so happened that I was hired in Cleveland Heights first. Got the call from the city of Cleveland Heights first.
So, Officer Mack, you've invoked the time in which you were growing up a few times in this conversation already. And we know that back in the day, community policing was a much more common approach. Can you speak to some of the changes you have witnessed in policing from the time of your youth through your time as an active officer and now what you see as a retired police officer?
That's an excellent statement and question. I'm going to take you all in a place where I think we'll all understand. In reference to my youth, I had really good experiences with police officers, law enforcement. From grade school on through, middle school, high school, I played sports all through school, stayed in school, kept my grades up. And I can honestly say that they were very helpful in assisting the kids at my time getting to and from practices, if it was late in the evening, games, if they seen you walking by yourself, they would escort you along, if not give you a ride. to make sure you were safe and secure getting home. That was the kind of community I grew up in East Cleveland. Now we live in a time, decades later, where families are broken up. The family structure is not there, not sound. And that's not everybody, but there's a good number. We have so many young boys, in particular Black boys, that don't have fathers at home. Their mothers are left to raise both boy and girls. And even with girls today, that's become more of a challenge. I took notice of that in the last, say, 20 years, was the girls are just as violent, maybe without the guns, but just as violent as the boys are at the high school level, fighting, some gang activity. And it's all about, where are the parents? Are the parents around? Are the parents available? Who's in control of the kids during the times of their development in life? So if you're left with, on one hand, either good parenting to put you in the direction, in the driver's seat of not only going to school, but doing things that are life and good and healthy for your life, or you're left alone with no family structure and left to the streets. And that's been a systemic problem for a couple of decades now.
You know, Officer Mack, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I also want to interject the fact that social dynamics have changed as well. You know, I grew up at a time where on my street, most of the fathers worked at Chevrolet or they worked at Ford. Mm-hmm. And many of the mothers were either LPNs or teachers. And so everybody was employed. People had a much more solid situation, home situation. You know, drugs may or may not have been as rampant. Unemployment wasn't necessarily a problem. And so, you know, we are contending with some other social situations that are impacting familial dynamics and social dynamics. Would you agree with that?
I agree with you 100%. You as a parent, mother or father, don't have gainful employment, you're left to struggle with what you do have. And if you have children, those kids have to eat just like the parents do. You can't survive without eating food and having water. That's the basic fundamental needs of life. So I agree with you 100%. You know, parents have to be in a position to be able to work and take care of their families.
The other thing I want to bring up in that same time frame was that maybe during the school year and when there were different events, whether it was a basketball game, a football game, there might have been that rivalry thing. But in the summertime, whether you were from East Cleveland, Cleveland Heights, Shaker, whether you went to John F. Kennedy or John Adams, we all knew each other. So it was like we didn't have reasons to do anything because we were all like friends. Did you find that to be true in your case?
Yes. Mr. Scott, boy, you really spoke to the truth there. I think about all of my friends who I grew up with and how on the weekends we would travel, whether it be by bicycle or car, or in some cases walking, depending on the distance, and
yes.
go and meet other boys from other schools and play against them out in the open blacktop courts. And it didn't matter which high school you attended. We were able to engage and play. There was no fear factor of guns being taunted and coming out to threaten someone's life, guns or knives. I mean, there may have been a shoving match on the court just out of the mere respect of competition, but there was never any real violence that concerned us about going out and engaging our brothers and sisters across the community.
You know, Officer Mack, you know, back in the day, it used to be about fist fights and knife fights. And now it's really about firearms, which more often than not are fatal. So we're really talking about a much more perilous dynamic. Can you speak about that from the perspective of a retired police officer?
Yes. And keep in mind, I haven't been retired just that long. It just became a year here earlier part of August. My last day working was August 9th last year. But, you know, after being active for 35 years, it's in the blood and it's there. I can speak to not only now, but over the last rock solid 10 years in the increase of gun violence. We've seen it. I think a part of this is the fact that young boys coming up again when you have parents that are rearing and raising you, and the fathers and the uncles, the grandfathers are around, you are taught how to defend yourself by your fist. But you weren't taught at the time to go out, purchase a gun, and use it against someone else. But when you don't have those fathers, grandfathers, uncles present, you're left to run the streets with others that may be like you, who don't have men in their family as well. And what's the first thing they think to do? Go and do what they see on television, grab a firearm, purchase a firearm, whether legal or illegal, and use it. Not taking into consideration that once you fire that bullet, chances are that person is not going to get up, depending on where you hit them at. So yes, in response to what you said about the firearms, I think that's a big reason behind it. We all come from an era where if you had to defend yourself, you were taught to use your hands. Use your hands. Don't go out and purchase a gun. Don't go out and shoot and kill somebody. And also, even with knives, I mean, that happened, but it wasn't that consistent.
Our conversation with retired police officer Quintero Mack continues after this. You're listening to Code M Radio. Don't forget to visit codemmagazine.com. Mr. Mack, let's talk about some of the things that were interesting in the city of Cleveland Heights. You did this thing where basically you went out and sat with people and sat with everybody in the city, where you kind of got out to know the public. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I will tell you, during the course of my entire career, I made it a point to get to know all the people that I serve. Good, bad, or indifferent. I realize that I'm going to be here for a long, lengthy career, bar no major injuries or tragedies. So I wanted to make sure that those that I came in contact with, I was able to impact their lives in a very positive way, irregardless of the situation. So they would remember this officer was making the effort to do right by them.
You know, Officer Mack, again, that's community policing. You took the time to get to know your community, and God willing, they took the time to get to know you. You made me think about a story that took place in San Francisco this year, where, you know, it was one of those Karen incidents where a man of Asian descent had put a sign out front in support of Black Lives Matter. And this woman and her husband accused him of vandalizing property, not knowing that it was his home. So they called the police on him. And when the police came, the police recognized him because he had lived in that community for 35 years. And he took the time to get to know the police officers. What advice do you have for folks now when community policing is really not the norm?
We needed to make it the norm. We need to make that the official lead in policing. And I think you're seeing more of that now in certain communities. I can't speak to all of them across the country, but for the most part around greater Cleveland, I can speak to the suburbs. They're starting to make that effort more and more so. I worked hand in hand with a community policing officer in Shaker Heights named Marty Dunn. He does an excellent, outstanding job over there in Shaker Heights with the schools. There was a time that, and obviously there are times we're real busy, so you can't do what you like every day, but we made the effort to get into our schools at the grade school level, the middle school, and go classroom to classroom to get to know those kids. Not only their teachers, and obviously the principal, but to get to know the kids, because these are the kids that's going to be in the community for a number of years before they branch off to college, to military, to trade school. So I was around long enough to see quite a few of the students get married, have their own kids here in the community before I left the department.
You know, I'm so happy to hear you make these remarks because my sense of you is that you really are interested and committed to police reform.
Yes.
And we know there are a ton of approaches out there. People talk about defunding the police. Can you clarify what that means for our audience?
Yeah, I took a note, several notes in reference to this, and I was at a recent speaking engagement here in Cleveland Heights with our current chief of police, Annette Mecklenburg. And one of the comments I made to everyone was, you need to understand what you're talking about when you make the statement defunding the police. To be quite frankly with you, it absolutely makes no sense. It's completely absurd and unjustified, and I'm going to tell you why. If a police department was to be defunded, take a backseat to the number of officers, the number of utilizing of equipment, such as cars to get them to the calls, just think about this. Who would that affect first? The poor and the lower middle class neighborhoods. Can you imagine an area that needs the police and without the proper manpower, women power, officers' response time will take much longer if they get there at all. Also, the ability to assist and back each other up becomes a steep uphill battle. So I don't think that's a great choice at all. A good choice, a good, great, indifferent, however you look at it. I think the right way to go with law enforcement is you have to get the bad police officers out of these departments. And the way to do that is to make sure that you have a protocol you follow on dealing with complaints. You can't wait. Give you an example. Officer Derek Chauvin, who pushed or put his knee on George Floyd's neck in Minnesota. You both recall how many complaints he had at that point?
Absolutely. It was quite a few.
He had close to 20 complaints.
I thought it was 30. I knew it was double digits.
Yeah. Now, think about this. I'm not talking about complaints regarding mishandling of a police report or maybe writing the wrong code on a ticket or someone fighting a traffic citation or wrong charge or something, even officers getting involved in accidents. I'm talking about the use of force here. So I can tell you from the department that I worked for, that was not tolerated at all. I worked for 3 different chiefs of police. And I'm here to tell you, even a minor to moderate infraction of use of force unnecessary, you're looking at written reprimand, suspension, and days off and loss of pay. Let something like that result into the unnecessary, unwarranted death of another, and I can assure you there are going to be criminal charges filed. I can assure you that you will be fired. We've had one too many of these incidents that have occurred across our country. And I look at it from this perspective also. I have the years of experience. I've been in every type of foot chase, car chase you can imagine. I can't tell you all how many times I've chased a guy in an alleyway, down a street, in the dark, tackled him, and never drew my firearm unless he had one. Now, you're chasing a bad guy. You don't always know when they have a gun, so that it's a tough task when you're running in the dark after somebody, because you've got to watch their movement, watch their hands, and that's very tough on the run. But I will tell you that I was in far more situations where I physically tackled a guy or guys and arrested them, and the gun never came out of the holster.
So, Officer Mack, I want to tell you that I think that suburban police forces, like the one you worked for in Cleveland Heights, are far better stewards, primarily of their fiscal responsibility to their residents. It seems that it's usually large municipalities that don't handle police brutality well. I also have to invoke this, and I do so as a graduate of Howard University School of Law.
Okay.
And as a former councilwoman in a little hamlet here in Cleveland. Defund the police does not mean exactly what you conveyed it to mean. What it means is it is not the elimination of a police force, but it is about reducing a budget for a police force and using portions of that money for other wraparound services in that community. So it's part of police reform. It is not the elimination of the police. And I want to encourage everybody to go online and look for a clip of Kamala Harris. At this time, she was either the AG for the state of California or she was a prosecutor for the city of San Francisco. And she said point blank, she said, Black folk want police officers. We want policemen who are going to attend to criminality in our community. But what we want, and I'm paraphrasing, is to be dealt with in more just fashions and to do just as you said, Officer Mack, to get those bad apples off the police force. So I'm invoking that simply as a corrective so people really understand that defund the police does not mean eliminate the police, but it does mean rectify police budgets so that there's more balance in terms of wraparound and social services for our community. So, but again, you are clearly a reform-minded police officer, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing in schools, because we know that the adultification of young African American students has often put them down the path of criminality. You know, that there's that kindergarten to prison pipeline that we have to eliminate, and good officers such as yourself will help us do that. Any reflections on what I've shared?
Yes, I appreciate you clearing up what you said about defunding the police. I think that also police work has evolved in a way where officers begin to get stretched too thin with their responsibilities. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Say the mental health aspect of it. Certainly we've had in-service training for dealing with the mental health issues and dealing with those that are bipolar, schizophrenic, and other issues. But that's at a ground roots level. You know what I mean? It's street level. It's not like a doctor taking control or a psychiatrist taking control of people who need to be, say, probated and go to the hospital. And I've been involved in those situations. It uses a lot of our resources and is time consuming when we have to do that because, of course, individuals who may suffer from those different mental issues, they may be violent. You may not know if they're violent. Maybe a social worker or a psychiatrist is on the scene and can't get in to see that party, and we've had to go and assist. So, that's a tough situation, and if that can work better with resources surrounding police work, that would be better. I'll give you another example. I started out here in Cleveland Heights in 1984. We had at that time 4 dog wardens, animal wardens, brother. 3 were full-time and 1 alternate. They worked different shifts when I first started. And I walked the beat as a rookie on Coventry in 1984. We evolved from having those animal control warden officers to none, from 4 to none. And the police officers end up having to undertake those responsibilities. Dog calls, bat calls, other type of animal calls, and it takes away from our regular police services.
How do you, and speaking of everything that you've just talked about, in your years, is there constant training? Are you going to seminars? Are you talking amongst yourselves? How do you handle it?
Well, each year we have designated in-service training, say late summer, beginning of fall, between August and September. There's in-service training that officers must attend for several days. It's at least, I'd say 2 or 3 days, where you're off the road and you cover every aspect of what you're doing and what you've been doing. That's the way we do it in our department. And now the Ohio Attorney General, prior to the current one, which was Mike DeWine, who's our governor, implemented a program involving law enforcement having to take online classes relevant to issues going on. For example, sex trafficking. There is a certain number of courses you had to take online, or you cannot be a police officer come January 1st that next year. They give you a deadline to do it by in December. And you start out the last part of the year, say the last 6 months, they give you several months and you have to take X number of courses. And if you don't complete that, then you cannot be a police officer until you complete it. It's the upgraded in-service training module for what we call Ohio Law Enforcement Gateway, pronounced as OLEG, OHLEG. Now, I don't know how that happened as it relates to this year, as you know, COVID-19 and all. They may not have been able to do it the same way they've done it in years past. But I know that's been very successful for Ohio law enforcement in upgrading training and education for areas of concern in what we do.
There's more from retired police officer Quintero Mack when Code M Radio returns. This segment is brought to you by Code M Magazine. Our guest today is retired police officer Quintero Mack. In listening to you for a while, there's I don't know, you seem to be very engaged. Did this trait come along from your upbringing? Where does this come from?
I think it's a combination of both. Let me start with upbringing. My father, who's now deceased as of December 2011, he was 84 years old, named Kirk Mack. He was one of 14 kids from Mississippi. My mother, currently, thank God, still alive. She's 85 years old as of January, named Lenora Mack, and she's one of 10 children. I have to say that a big part of my upbringing was understanding what it meant to follow the rules of the household, understanding what it meant to be respectful of others, to understand others' concerns and plights, because our parents always told us to make sure that you understand it is important that you know you represent this family. My father set my brother and I down. You all may even be familiar with my younger brother. He's a well-known attorney here in Greater Cleveland, Northeast Ohio, named Fernando Mack. He was a former county prosecutor, now defense attorney. But he set us down and said, your last name represents this family. Whatever choices you make out away from our home comes back here. I don't want any negative mess coming back to my house. You need to understand that you need to carry yourself and conduct yourself in a fashion where it's respectful to this household. He made that abundantly clear to us. And I'm 4 years older than my younger brother. So at that time, I think I was in the 9th grade. I may have been in the 10th grade, and I think he was in the 6th grade. I have an older brother from my dad's first marriage. He went to Glenville. He's in his 60s. His name is Kirk Mack Jr., and he had the same lesson as an educator, administrator, coming forward.
So, Officer Mack, tell me, how do you, as an African-American man, reconcile your experience in law enforcement and the current iteration of Black Lives Matter, which is calling for an end to police brutality, particularly against Black and brown bodies?
Yeah, it's a tough situation that I have the highest respect for. I'll tell you this too. I want to add this in. Don't believe for one instance that during my years of service that I didn't experience racial injustice, racial overtone myself. I came on the police department at a time when there weren't that many Blacks in the suburbs. And certainly when I arrived in Cleveland Heights, I think there was, maybe 6 or 7 officers here of African-American descent, and there were 3 of us that were hired. So it ended up being around 10 or 11 at that time. The department was less than 20% Black. I would say closer to 10 to 15.
Mm-hmm.
So I had some experiences that really made me understand why my parents responded the way they did, to understand how to deal with those situations in life down the line. As it relates to Black Lives Matter, Black lives absolutely, unequivocally matter, because it's Black lives that are being taken more so with unarmed Black men today. We see it time and time again. But I also want to say that our race has to understand that we have a dual responsibility to look out and take care of each other. We have to stop killing and hurting each other. We have a lot of Black on Black crime. And I don't see, to the degree I do when a white officer kills an unarmed Black man, I don't see that same response when our young Black males are killing each other. And that's happening in greater Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and any of the big cities. And my message to our young folks is simple as this. You want us to be respected. I want Black lives to be respected. Well, we have to respect each other. We have to value each other's lives, because if we can show that we value each other's lives, then that's all the more reason to make others understand to respect our lives too. But it starts with us. I tell young guys all the time, you may be angry about something, but you don't have to take anyone's life. I'm not advocating going out there to commit thefts, robberies, stealing, cheating. But if you're going to take that chance and go out there and commit a crime, you know that you must face the time. But in committing that crime, you don't have to take someone's life. Life should be held at its highest value, at its highest value. And we have to get our young people to understand that amongst ourselves, not just when it comes to law enforcement, but with ourselves.
Yeah, I think you've said so many things that are crucial. And, you know, we know there's a distinction between quote unquote Black on Black crime. We know that inter-ethnic crime happens in every community.
Mm-hmm.
White folks kill white folks, Asian folks kill Asian folks, Mexican folks kill Mexican folks. We also know, and you said this so poignantly, that human life is of value.
Yes.
We have to move it to the highest rung on the ladder within our community, and we need police officers to understand that Black lives do in fact matter, and that you cannot just kill us with impunity, which is what has been happening. I think what people have to understand that more often than not, our legal system, our justice system does work when it comes to inter-ethnic criminality. You know, if a Mexican man kills a Mexican woman or child, more often than not, he is going to be arrested, charged, convicted, and sent to prison. And I think for most African Americans, we have been dealing with this harsh reality that police officers seldom, if ever, go to jail for killing a Black person.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's that issue of immunity that we have to address. And I think you actually alluded to that very early on in this conversation, that police officers do have to be held accountable. Now, what do you think, Officer Mack, it will take for that to happen?
I believe wholeheartedly that when officers, and I'm going to say this very clearly, when officers use unnecessary force that results in the death of another, regardless of color, you have to be held accountable for your actions, both criminally and morally. Because here's what we don't want. We don't want a situation where you get a percentage of people out there across the country that says, well, you know what? We damned if we do, we damned if we don't. We might as well just start shooting at blue. We might as well just start taking their lives unnecessarily. You all may not know this, but we lose a police officer in the United States of America an average of every 56, 57 hours, between 55 to 60 hours ongoing.
Wow.
Whether it be to car accidents, gunfire, or some other incident. We lose a law enforcement officer on the average. of between 55 and 60 hours across the country. I've been to the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Wall in DC. We now have, I'm willing to bet 21,000 names up there, if not more. It's got to be close, right around that number. I was there on several different occasions, including two of my fellow officers who were killed in the line of duty here in Cleveland Heights, Jason West, 31 years old in 2007, by gunfire. And then another officer who was in a foot chase and had a heart attack named Thomas Patton in March of 2010. Mm. For 23 years I worked on the department, we had not lost anyone. All of a sudden, within a stretch of, 3 years, we lose 2 officers. And during that time, there were other officers that were killed in the line of duty across Ohio, Northeast Ohio, whose funerals I attended. I was not only a longtime police officer, but in the capacity of as a police officer. You see on my bio, was an honor guard for almost 20 years, carrying the American flag and having to be at police funerals. I was a SWAT team member for about 14 or so years. Not just basic patrol general duty. I worked in the crime division right about 24 years. So I've seen just about everything you can imagine.
So here's the tough thing. And we hear this question asked all the time, but I need to hear your take on this. If I am stopped, traffic violation, if I'm standing somewhere and maybe I shouldn't be, tell me, how should I react? What should my behavior be?
Okay. And this is very tough because I know that, I don't represent all of the departments across the country. I don't know all the departments in their interactions with their community.
Right.
But I would say to you in Cleveland Heights, which is a great question. I would say to you, if you get pulled over by the police, and that's a good question. There's 3 or 4 elements to take into consideration here. I would say make the effort to cooperate with the officer that stops you, because obviously you won't know the officer's attitude or demeanor until you communicate with him or her. So make the effort to cooperate, be positive, respectfully communicate with the officer, and expect the same conduct and courtesy back in return. So in other words, if I stop you, I'll give you an example of how I've done it. Good afternoon or good evening, Mr. Scott. The reason I stopped you is you ran a red light or you were speeding. Or I may even ask you, sir, Mr. Scott, do you know why I stopped you? And that will help me determine where your head is. Because I have to find out if you're under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Maybe you have a mental issue. Maybe something else is going on with you. Maybe you work 2 shifts, you're tired. It can be a number of things, but I've got to at least make the effort to communicate with you and get you to speak back with me clearly and precisely. I would say when speaking back with the officer, I would tell anyone, don't utilize street slang or street codes. Talk clearly and be effective. If the officer becomes combative and disrespectful and unnecessarily violent, and you have truly unconditionally attempted the efforts of those elements I've mentioned, I would suggest at that point, tell the officer you're going to call the police department and ask to speak to the officer in charge or supervisor, and let them know right then and there what you're going through. And I'm basing this on the way things have been happening today. Years gone by in the past, I wouldn't even suggest that, because we didn't see what we see happening now, where so many unarmed Black men, and in some cases a few Black women, have been killed over what? I look at Eric Gardner. He was selling cigarettes and loose CDs. I'm trying to wrap my mind around the fact that he lost his life selling cigarettes and CDs. That should never have occurred. There were 4 or 5 officers on the scene, and one of them choked him out. My question is, how do we escalate to that point? I'm the officer on that scene, and I've come in contact with him in the past because maybe the business district didn't want him there. I would have said, Mr. Gardner, I've warned you before. Now I'm going to have to issue a ticket for whatever you're doing. Solicitation, trespassing. I'm going to write you a ticket if I don't arrest you and send you to court. But at the end of the day, I'm not trying to take your life. And all police officers have to have the desire to value others' lives like they value their own and their families. Irregardless of race, you must be able to value others' lives. So that's why I gave you an example of how to handle it that way. But hopefully you come across an officer like me.
When we come back, we'll hear more from retired police officer Quintero Mack when Code M Radio returns. Welcome back to Code M Radio. If you need more information on Code M Magazine, visit our website, codemmagazine.com. I want to follow up on my previous question. And this is what always has bugged me. They're always going to ask me for my license and registration. And I'll follow up with I'm also videotaping this with my phone. Where should my license and registration be? Because I feel as though if I'm going to reach into my glove compartment, they might think that there's something else in the glove compartment. Should I put it in the visor? Should I put it on my seat? Where can I reach to maintain safety?
That's an excellent point. And I hadn't even thought about that aspect of it. It's amazing what we think we have to do in these times to be safe. But if you feel it deemed necessary, providing you would get stopped by a law enforcement officer anywhere, I would say your sun visor is a good place so you don't have to reach in your back pocket to pull out a wallet or in your front pocket. Because at the heart of this traffic stop is the communication between the driver and the law enforcement officer. That is a critical key component. How we communicate between each other makes the difference in how the interaction should unfold. I'll use myself as an example. I walk up to your car. It's 2 a.m. I've made traffic stops 2, 3, 4, 5 in the morning many a times. Mr. Scott, I stop you for a speeding violation and your lights are off. May I see your driver's license and proof of insurance? And you may say, hey, officer, I have it in my car, but this is where it's located. Okay, you've communicated to me where your license and registration is if it's not on your person. Whether it be in your glove box, the console between the driver and passenger seat, or on the sun visor, you have communicated with me where it is. I should not respond in such an overzealous, fearful manner where I feel like I have to draw my gun on you because I'm thinking automatically you're reaching for something else other than your ID. I would say illuminate the car. You're getting stopped on the traffic stop, turn your interior lights on. And what I tell my family and friends, put your hands 12 o'clock at the top of the steering wheel, or put your hands out of the window on the car door so the officer can see your hands. That puts the officer at ease, at least it should, put the officer at ease and put you at a calm place. I will tell you, I've made many traffic stops over the years where people have had guns in the car because they have to carry concealed permit. Not once did I feel like my life was threatened based on the scenario that they communicated with me, that they have a firearm and that they have their credentials, driver's license, carry concealed ID, car is illuminated, we're communicating, they're not acting suspicious, acting like they want to become violent with me. So I've never had to feel like I needed to draw my firearm in that situation.
So, Officer Mack, you really forecasted my question, which is piggybacking off of Daryl's. So I'm mindful of a couple of things. I'm mindful of the very brutal murder of Philando Castile, who was licensed to carry and who informed the officer that murdered him that he was licensed to carry. It's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the state of Ohio, is it true that when a driver's license is run through a police system, the police in advance is notified that that person is licensed to carry? Correct me if I'm wrong there, give insight into that, and then really tell us how we are to handle. You have not been, you've not gone over the top when you encountered somebody who was licensed to carry, but we know that other police officers have. What is the best approach? Do you have any other additional guidance?
Well, that officer that responded that way, I'm curious as to what even made him feel that his life was being threatened. Based on my observation of the video, he overreacted. The young man, I've used that as an example, Philandro Castile, he intentionally told him that he had his firearm. He intentionally told him that he had his carry concealed permit and driver's license. He also had I believe his girlfriend, lady in the car, and his child. So unless you know something about him going into this situation as a very violent felony offender, I don't know why that reaction came about by that officer. I'm really mystified with what I've seen on that video. I'm baffled as to why he responded that way. Because again, if he had something to hide and his intention was to get away from that traffic stop unscathed and going about his way of committing crimes, or if his intention was to potentially do something to the police officer, I don't know that he would have told you he had a firearm. So I really, that particular case really bothered me when I watched the video, and I'm sure many others across the country, because that officer should have looked at him with his lady and with that child as his own family, sitting in that car being stopped by a police officer somewhere else. What was the fear factor that made him feel like he had to draw his weapon and fire on him in that car? I don't know what his reason was behind it. I would love to have heard that interview and when this incident went to court, but I haven't. So the only thing I can tell you is that today, because of some of these incidents that have occurred, officers are forced to make better decisions using their body cameras and showing what's unfolding. But I would say, I'll go this far. With that as an example, Philandro Castile, and based on that officer's reaction, he never needed to be a police officer. If you're that frightened to deal with people where you feel the need to pull your firearm and take someone's lives when they haven't attempted to take yours, you don't deserve or need to be a police officer, because you put all the good officers in a bad place and in harm's way.
I so agree with you, Officer Mack. And before we conclude this conversation, we have got to ask you about the Castle Doctrine, especially as it pertains to the case of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky.
Let me go over this with you, and I made sure that I looked it up, and it was still the same, but it reads a little different between Ohio and Kentucky. So in Ohio, the Castle Law was adopted in 2008, and what it says is the law presumes that someone, meaning the victim, acted in self-defense when a suspect unlawfully enters their residence or their vehicle. An example of the vehicle, and I want to clarify this, not when a vehicle is unoccupied, when someone breaks into your car and steals it and drives it down the street. No, I'm talking when someone attempts to, say, do an armed robbery, carjacking, force you out of your car at gunpoint. That would be an example of using deadly force to defend yourself based on the Castle Doctrine. But it reads a little different from Ohio to Kentucky. And remember now, state laws vary. Kentucky says the Castle Doctrine is a Castle Doctrine state and has a, in quotation marks, stand your ground law, which is the same as in Florida. A person who is not engaged in an unlawful activity and who is attacked in any other place where he or she has a right to be has no duty to retreat. Okay, any person who uses a gun in self-defense has immunity from criminal and civil law. Now this is the state of Kentucky. What is different here that I don't see in Ohio is it doesn't say in Ohio a person who is not engaged in an unlawful activity who is attacked in any other place where he or she has a right to be. So it sounds like to me in Kentucky, you don't have to be at home to use force. You could be at a place of business or your business. You can in Ohio too, in terms of protecting your business or your home. But it specifically says here, attack in any other place where he or she has the right to be. I think that's more broad in terms of the Castle Doctrine than Ohio. Ohio pretty much leads one to believe it's your home, your residency, or your vehicle.
Yeah, so what has baffled people about the Breonna Taylor case is that, she was shot 8 times after the police executed a no-knock warrant on the wrong home. And because they did that, Breonna Taylor's boyfriend, who was licensed to carry, fired on the police. And so he was standing his ground. He was operating within the parameters of the Castle Doctrine. And for that reason, most of us who are not in law enforcement, who are not judges, deem this an unlawful killing. So Officer Mack, again, thank you for your time today. Thank you for clarifying some very crucial points for us. And Daryl and I are just pleased that we had an opportunity to converse with you today.
You're quite welcome. I wanted to comment on that too. As it relates to law enforcement, and like I said, I've been on raids. I've been in situations where, as an active police officer, whether in SWAT or out of SWAT and special operations, one thing that is true that has to be in place before you execute a warrant, you have to know you have the right location, right address. You cannot afford to make the mistake of going to the wrong residence. Cannot. It has to be factual, 100% unequivocally true that you have the right location. So this type of situation does not unfold.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is the retired police officer, Quintero Mack. I've learned things today. It was a pleasure to speak to you. And for myself and the Reverend Dr. Leah Lewis, I am Daryl Scott. Join us again next week for another edition of Code M Radio.